It was 1994, and it was in April that it started, but there's a long history before that, dating back to probably the 1950s, right? So it didn't, of course, it didn't happen overnight, but in the span of 100 days, starting in April in 1994, about 1 million people were killed by, it was 1 million Rwandans by their fellow Rwandans. So it was neighbors killing neighbors. And there were two, like, I will say tribes. That's controversial, okay, but it was Hutu and Tutsi, and the Hutu population was the majority, about 80%, and they were directed to kill the Tutsi, which is about 20% of the country.
Jeez.
So, and this was 1 million people, and that represented 10% of the population. At the time, there were only about 10 million people. It's a tiny country, okay? So it's the size of Vermont, where I grew up. Vermont has less than 1 million people in the whole state, and Rwanda is about the same size in terms of landmass. It's very mountainous. It's beautiful. It's densely populated. Most people are farming. So it is considered a civil war. Um, there's like a long history of colonization and how those two groups of people were kind of pitted against each other. But I will say that everything I've read and learned from people there is that they were living peacefully at one time. So there were Hutus married to Tutsis. It was like incredibly amicable. But so that was what happened that year, and it's been what, 30, almost 31 years. And now what we're looking at is the generational transfer of trauma. So it's still very, for someone who hasn't had trauma healing, it's very fresh. Trauma does not know any time, so it's like,
Right.
it could have been yesterday. So many people are now living back in the same communities, and like many people went to prison or they fled. And immediately after, like the following year, this is an interesting fact too, women in Rwanda were not allowed to own land.
Wow.
I think it was 1997. So it took about 3 years from the genocide for them to, because they were left with land. The men, in many cases, were either killed or they left or they went to
Right.
jail. So the women are left with land that technically they didn't own, and they were the head of household. Many children were head of household. So that was, had to be a very interesting time. I think there were only three psychologists in the whole country, like
Holy.
following the genocide. So
Woo.
when I
Talk about
moved there,
under resourced. That's
under-resourced, yeah.
wild.
In 2009, when I moved there, it was, beautiful, clean, safe. But the people I work with before I left said there's two things we still really need. We need jobs and we need trauma healing. And so when I moved back to the state, eventually I had another stop along the way, but my first mission was to create a nonprofit to work with women there that had experienced trauma, particularly sexual trauma, which was a big part of the genocide as well. Many women were intentionally infected with HIV, AIDS,
Goodness.
were pregnant from rape. And that's a whole
Gosh.
nother set of issues with children being born of rape.